In the basement of a fake bakery on Bernauer Straße, 3 West Berlin students stand shin-deep in wet clay at 2 a.m., staring at 70 meters of hand-dug tunnel and 75 more meters of packed earth between them and the apartment block on the far side of the wall. Above them, Stasi watchtowers sweep searchlights across the street every 90 seconds. The tunnel is 70 centimeters high, barely enough to crawl through on your elbows. They have no excavation permits, no heavy machinery, and no way to remove 12 tons of dirt without triggering a raid. This is not a state-sponsored intelligence operation. It is a logistics problem, solved with shovels, suitcases, and a storefront scam, where the soil mechanics are as deadly as the informants. Earlier that spring, in April 1964, a group of West Berlin University students rented a basement on Bernauer Straße and registered a bakery business with the district office. The storefront had a painted sign, a cash register, and no flour deliveries. The real work happened at night, excavation shifts with shovels and pickaxes, starting from a vertical shaft in the basement floor. The target was an apartment block 145 meters away in East Berlin, across the death strip and under the wall. The students were not engineers. They were literature and law majors who had learned soil mechanics from library books and trial excavation in a friend's garden outside the city. The planned tunnel cross-section measured 70 centimeters high and 80 centimeters wide. That size was small enough to evade Stasi ground-penetrating surveys, which were calibrated to detect voids larger than 1 cubic meter, and just large enough for an adult to crawl through on hands and knees. Each cubic meter of Berlin clay weighs roughly 1.8 tons. A 145-meter tunnel with a cross-section of 0.56 square meters would displace approximately 12 tons of soil. All of it had to leave the building in suitcases during daylight hours, carried by different people on different streets, because the same face twice in 1 week was a surveillance flag for Stasi informants watching foot traffic near the wall. Stasi watchtowers flanked Bernauer Straße with direct sightlines to the bakery entrance. Searchlights swept the street every 90 seconds after dark. Any construction truck, visible dirt pile, or repeated night activity triggered an investigation report to the Ministry for State Security within 24 hours. The students had no excavation permit and could not apply for one. West Berlin law required notification to the 4 power authorities for any construction within 100 meters of the wall, and those notifications were automatically shared with East German border control under the occupation agreements still in force. A permit application was a confession. So the dirt had to move in suitcases, and the digging had to happen in silence. 3 other tunnels in the West Berlin network had been raided in the past 6 months. Stasi arrested the diggers and the East German contacts who had provided exit addresses. The students realized an informant had access to multiple tunnel locations and schedules, but they had no background check system and no intelligence resources. Trust decisions were made on instinct in under 48 hours, because East German escapees who offered help could not wait in West Berlin without risking deportation under occupation police rules. The informant could be anyone: a courier, an escapee's relative, or a digger recruited from the university. The network had no way to know until another tunnel was raided and the pattern became clear. West Berlin law prohibited unlicensed construction within 100 meters of the wall, and any application for an excavation permit triggered automatic notification to the 4 power occupation authorities. Those notifications were shared with East German border control under agreements meant to prevent underground sabotage or weapons caches. The moment the students filed paperwork, Stasi would know the address and the planned depth. So there was no legal path. The tunnel had to be dug without permits, without construction vehicles, and without any activity visible from the street or the watchtowers. The constraint was absolute: operate invisibly or be raided before the tunnel reached the wall. The bakery storefront had to appear commercially viable for 6 months without generating any legitimate business. No flour deliveries, no morning customer lines, no suppliers asking questions. The students stocked the front window with day-old bread bought from a real bakery 2 blocks away and replaced it weekly to avoid mold. They kept the lights on during business hours and the door unlocked. A single neighbor complaint to the district police about a suspicious business would trigger a commercial inspection, and the inspection would find the basement shaft within minutes. The illusion had to be perfect and indefinite, because the tunnel dig would take at least 5 months. Berlin clay sits above a water table that fluctuates between 3 and 5 meters below street level, depending on seasonal rainfall. Dig too deep and groundwater floods the tunnel, collapsing the walls and drowning anyone inside. Dig too shallow and the tunnel ceiling is less than 2 meters below the surface, where surface subsidence, a visible sag in the pavement, would appear on Stasi aerial reconnaissance photographs. The students chose a depth of 4 meters, just above the water table and just deep enough to avoid detection from above. That depth gave them less than half a meter of margin. A wet spring or a miscalculation in elevation would flood the tunnel and end the operation. A 145-meter tunnel with only one open end becomes a sealed tube. Human respiration consumes oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. Without active ventilation, CO2 concentration exceeds 3% within 20 minutes, and diggers lose consciousness before they realize they are hypoxic. The students built a hand-crank ventilation fan from a bicycle wheel and sheet metal, mounted at the tunnel entrance. One person cranked while 2 dug. The fan pushed fresh air down the tunnel at roughly 40 liters per minute, enough to keep the diggers conscious but not comfortable. Every meter deeper into the clay made the air supply problem worse, because the fan had to push air farther against friction losses in the tunnel walls. Dirt removal had to occur during daylight business hours using suitcases carried by different couriers on different streets. The students recruited university classmates and friends who had no visible connection to the tunnel group. Each courier made 1 trip per week, carrying roughly 20 kilograms of clay in a suitcase to a disposal site, a construction lot, a riverbank, a park where fresh soil would not stand out. 12 tons of clay required approximately 600 suitcase trips over 5 months. The couriers had to vary their routes, their schedules, and their appearances. A single courier spotted twice by the same Stasi plainclothes observer would trigger a tale and lead investigators straight back to the bakery. In late September 1964, Stasi raided a tunnel 2 blocks north on Bernauer Straße. The dig crew was arrested at the West Berlin entrance, and the East German contact who had provided the exit address was taken into custody on the eastern side. Western newspapers reported the raid within 48 hours. The students operating Tunnel 57 knew the arrested contact personally. He had met with 2 other tunnel coordinators in West Berlin to discuss exit logistics. That meant an informant had access to multiple tunnel locations, schedules, and personnel rosters. The network could not identify the source, but the exposure was undeniable. The question became, how long before the informant reported Tunnel 57? The Tunnel 57 crew made a decision. Accelerate the dig to completion in 2 weeks instead of 4. That meant doubling the excavation rate, accepting higher collapse risk from faster digging, and moving the escape date forward to October 3rd, before the informant could report the new timeline. The students added a 3rd shift and extended night work to 6 hours. They stopped rotating couriers for dirt removal and used the same 5 people on compressed schedules, gambling that speed would outrun surveillance pattern recognition. The margin for error disappeared. A single collapse, a single courier arrest, or a single neighbor complaint would end the operation before the tunnel reached the East Berlin basement. The target was a specific apartment basement in East Berlin, 145 meters from the bakery entrance. The address had been provided by an escapee who had fled 3 months earlier and knew the building layout. The crew had to break through the final meter of foundation wall in 1 night, without alerting residents or triggering seismic sensors Stasi had installed along the wall corridor after earlier tunnel discoveries. The breakthrough would use hand chisels and a small crowbar, not hammers or power tools. The noise had to stay below the ambient sound level of street traffic and building ventilation systems. The crew estimated they had a 4-hour window between midnight and 4 a.m., when street noise peaked and residents were asleep. To make room for faster dirt removal, the crew removed the hand crank ventilation fan and relied on natural diffusion from the tunnel entrance. CO2 levels in the tunnel climbed above 2%, causing headaches and shortened breath, but the new deadline could not slip. Diggers worked in 30-minute rotations instead of hour-long shifts, crawling out to the entrance to breathe fresh air before returning. The trade-off was explicit. Accept mild hypoxia during the final 2 weeks of excavation, or miss the October 3rd escape date and risk betrayal. No one voted against the change. The crew understood the arithmetic. 2 weeks of discomfort versus indefinite exposure to the informant. On the night of October 2nd, the crew reached the foundation wall of the East Berlin apartment block. They had covered 144 meters in 5.5 months. 1 meter of concrete remained. The crew worked in silence with hand chisels and a small pry bar, removing chunks of concrete no larger than a fist to minimize noise. By 3 a.m., they had opened a gap 40 centimeters wide and whispered through the opening to the East German contact waiting in the basement above. The contact confirmed the apartment was clear and the residents were asleep. The crew widened the gap to 70 centimeters, just large enough for an adult to squeeze through, and set the escape for the following night, October 3rd at 10 p.m. Berlin clay at 4 meters depth has a cohesion strength of 20 to 30 kilopascals. That means an unsupported span longer than 1.5 meters will sag under its own weight, and any impact above 50 kilograms per square meter triggers immediate collapse. The students installed wooden support beams every 1.2 meters for the first 120 meters of tunnel. For the final 25 meters approaching the East Berlin exit, they removed all shoring to avoid detection by Stasi ground-penetrating probes. In that unsupported section, each digger had to crawl on elbows and toes, distributing body weight below 40 kilograms per square meter. A knee drop or a stumble would concentrate force on a single point and bring the ceiling down. A 70-centimeter high crawl space limits movement to a forward crawl at roughly 3 meters per minute for an uninjured adult. Covering 145 meters requires 48 minutes per person under ideal conditions. No hesitation, no panic, no physical obstruction. The crew planned for 57 escapees. At 48 minutes each with 0 turnaround time, the extraction would take 45 hours. That was impossible. So they planned for continuous flow. One person enters the East Berlin end every 5 minutes, while the previous person is still crawling. That model assumed no one would freeze in panic, no one would injure themselves in the darkness, and no one would block the tunnel by stopping to rest. If a single person stopped, everyone behind them would be trapped. Human respiration produces approximately 1 liter of carbon dioxide per minute at rest. Under stress, crawling in darkness through a confined space, that rate climbs to 1.5 liters per minute. 57 people exhaling into a sealed 145-meter tunnel with a 0.56 square meter cross-section would raise CO2 concentration to 4% in under 90 minutes. At 4%, cognitive impairment is immediate. At 6%, unconsciousness follows within minutes. The crew could not rely on natural diffusion from the entrance. The tunnel was too long and the cross-section too small. They needed active airflow, which meant running a blower during the escape. The blower hum would be audible at street level, but the alternative was mass asphyxiation in the tunnel. The crew tested the electric blower at the tunnel entrance on the night of October 2nd. The hum was audible from the bakery storefront and faintly audible from the street when traffic noise dropped. They calculated the risk: run the blower at full speed and accept potential acoustic detection, or run it intermittently and risk CO2 buildup during off cycles. They chose full speed. The blower pushed approximately 120 liters of fresh air per minute into the tunnel, enough to keep concentration below 3% if the escape took less than 4 hours. If the extraction ran longer, or if someone blocked the tunnel and slowed the flow, the ventilation margin would disappear and people at the back of the queue would start losing consciousness before they reached the exit. For the final 25 meters of tunnel approaching the East Berlin exit, the crew removed all wooden support beams to avoid detection by Stasi ground probes. In that unsupported section, the ceiling was held up only by the cohesion strength of the clay, roughly 25 kilopascals. A crawling adult weighs between 60 and 80 kilograms. Distributing that weight over a contact area of 0.5 square meters, elbows, knees, and toes, produces a bearing pressure of 120 to 160 kilopascals, well above the clay's strength. To stay below the collapse threshold, each person had to crawl on elbows and toes only, maximizing contact area and keeping knees off the ground. The technique was exhausting and slow, but it was the only way to cross the unsupported zone without triggering a collapse. The escape began at 10 p.m. on October 3, 1964. The first escapee, a 32-year-old electrician from East Berlin, entered the tunnel from the apartment basement and began crawling toward the bakery 145 meters away. He had no flashlight, no communication link to the far end, and no way to know if the tunnel was clear or if Stasi had already discovered the entrance. The crew in West Berlin heard nothing for the first 48 minutes. Then, the electrician's hand emerged from the tunnel entrance in the bakery basement, and two students pulled him out. He had made it. The second person entered the East Berlin end immediately. The continuous flow had begun. At 1:15 a.m., a Stasi foot patrol heard the electric blower hum from the street, traced it to the apartment block, and forced entry into the basement. They opened fire into the tunnel entrance. One escapee, a 19-year-old woman halfway through the crawl, was shot in the leg. Her scream echoed down the 145-meter tunnel and reached the bakery end, where the crew heard it but could not see conditions at the far side. They faced an immediate decision: continue the extraction and risk more gunfire, or abort and abandon the remaining people still in the East Berlin basement waiting to enter. They had no radio link and no way to assess Stasi's strength or position. The crew made the call to continue. With 17 people still in the tunnel and gunfire audible at the East Berlin end, the crew increased the blower speed to maximum. The goal was to clear gunpowder smoke and reduce panic-induced hyperventilation that would accelerate CO2 buildup. The blower hum became loud enough to hear from the street, but the alternative was letting CO2 concentration climb above 4% and triggering mass impairment in the tunnel. The increased airflow bought them roughly 30 additional minutes of safe extraction time, but it also increased the chance that another Stasi patrol would trace the noise to the bakery. The crew kept the blower running and waited for the next person to emerge. 17 people were still inside the tunnel when the gunfire started. The crew in West Berlin could not communicate with them, could not see them, and could not stop them from crawling forward into the unknown. Each person had to make an individual decision: keep crawling toward the sound of gunfire and hope the West Berlin end was still clear, or turn back and face arrest in East Berlin. All 17 kept crawling. The next person emerged from the bakery tunnel entrance at 1:32 a.m., then another at 1:37, then another at 1:41. The continuous flow resumed. The crew counted faces and waited for the last person to appear. The final escapee, a 46-year-old schoolteacher, emerged from the bakery tunnel entrance at 2:10 a.m. The crew counted 57 people total. One had been shot in the leg at the East Berlin exit, but had crawled the remaining 130 meters and made it across. The blower was shut down. The tunnel entrance in the bakery basement was sealed with boards and sandbags. By 8 a.m., Stasi had poured concrete into the East Berlin entrance, filling the first 10 meters of the tunnel. The operation was over. 57 people had crawled 145 meters in darkness through unsupported clay under Stasi gunfire, and every one of them reached West Berlin alive. Stasi records released after German reunification showed the informant was an East German courier who had escaped to West Berlin in August 1964 and volunteered to help the tunnel network. He reported the location of the September tunnel that was raided 2 blocks north, but he had no knowledge of the Tunnel 57 timeline because the crew accelerated the schedule after his last contact. The decision to compress the dig from 4 weeks to 2 weeks outran the informant's reporting cycle. Speed, not security, saved the operation. The informant was never prosecuted. He disappeared into West Germany under a new identity after the wall fell. The Tunnel 57 escape was the largest single mass escape in Berlin Wall history. Western media covered the story within 48 hours, and photographs of the tunnel entrance appeared in newspapers across Europe and the United States. East Germany responded by deploying ground-penetrating radar along the wall corridor and increasing foot patrols near Bernauer Straße. The new radar systems could detect voids larger than 0.3 cubic meters at depths up to 6 meters, making shallow, hand-dug tunnels far more difficult to conceal. 3 subsequent tunnel attempts on Bernauer Straße were detected and raided before completion. The detection technology had caught up with the diggers. The student crew documented the Tunnel 57 dig in a typewritten manual covering soil mechanics, ventilation rates, dirt removal logistics, and crawl techniques. The manual included the cohesion strength calculation for Berlin clay, the CO2 concentration curve for sealed tunnels, and the suitcase courier rotation schedule. Copies circulated to other tunnel groups in West Berlin. At least 12 subsequent tunnel attempts used the manual's methods. 5 succeeded in moving escapees to the west. The manual became the standard reference for civilian-led escape tunnels until ground-penetrating radar made shallow tunneling obsolete in 1966. One original copy is preserved in the Berlin Wall Memorial Archive. Between 1961 and 1989, at least 57 documented tunnels were dug under the Berlin Wall. Most were betrayed by informants or collapsed before completion. Some were detected by Stasi ground-penetrating radar. Others flooded when diggers miscalculated the water table. The cumulative total of successful escapes via tunnel is estimated at over 300 people. Tunnel 57 alone accounted for nearly 1/5 of that total. The hand-dug tunnel remained the highest throughput escape method until the wall fell in 1989. But it was also the most resource-intensive and the most vulnerable to betrayal. No tunnel after 1966 moved more than 20 people in a single operation. The bakery building on Bernauer Straße was preserved after German reunification and converted into a Cold War memorial site. The tunnel entrance in the basement remains accessible for historical tours. A plaque on the building exterior lists the names of the 57 escapees and the students who dug the tunnel. The 145-meter route is marked on the street above with a bronze line embedded in the pavement, tracing the path from the bakery to the apartment block. Visitors can stand at both ends and measure the distance with their eyes. It is longer than a city block. It was dug with shovels, moved in suitcases, and crossed in darkness by 57 people who gambled their lives on the cohesion strength of Berlin clay.